Hey everyone, it's Megan Cuniff with Legal Affairs and Trials.com, here to break down the Danny Masterson trial for you. I was in the courtroom yesterday when the jury returned its two guilty verdicts against him, and it was a long time coming. This was the second trial after the first jury back in November couldn't decide. They deadlocked in favor of acquittal, actually, for Danny, but this last jury had a much different take on the case. They convicted on two counts and then hung 8-4 in favor of a guilty on the third count. And these are two counts of forcible rape. They each carry 15 years to life in prison. And Masterson has been out on a $3.3 million bond since he was first charged back in June 2020, but he was taken into custody on the spot after the verdict was read. The judge dismissed the jury and they left the courtroom, so they didn't see him handcuffed. But then the judge ordered him what's called remanded to custody, and she said that this was a really routine thing for such serious charges and convictions as what he has. His lawyer Phil Cohen did argue against it. Somewhat asked the judge Charlaine Olmedo to consider his age at the time of the crimes versus his age now, and then the amount of time that had passed. These are two rapes that occurred back in 2003, but of course the judge declined, just said that remand to jail was pretty standard here. So he was handcuffed, and that was really upsetting to his wife, Bijou Phillips. She and Danny have been married for several years. They have a 7-8-year-old daughter who has not been at the courthouse at all, but Masterson's family was pretty visibly shocked by the verdict. This was the 8th day of deliberation, and I think there was a lot of hope going into this second trial from them that Danny would even be acquitted of some of this stuff. So with the jury dragging on for 8 days, I think they were hopeful for at least a hung jury, but they had gotten word at 11 a.m. that day. The jury had sent a note saying that they had reached a verdict on two of the counts, but that they couldn't decide on the third count, and they were wondering how to proceed. So I was sitting in the courtroom when that happened. We heard the buzzes from the jury, which indicate that they have a question. There were the two buzzes. The other reporters in the courtroom, one of them asked, "Is it a question?" And the clerk it just seemed like something was up. He said it was a question, but it wasn't. It just didn't seem like a normal kind of question. And it was about 11:30 when they closed the courtroom and told us. Usually they don't close it until noon, but they closed it at 11:30, and we were all told to come back at 1:30. And the way the clerk said, I recommend you be here at 1:30. It was pretty obvious that this wasn't just going to be a question about a legal issue or a jury instruction or some kind of that, and then they get an answer and go back to deliberating. I mean, especially on the 8th day of deliberation after Memorial Day weekend like that. We were all expecting something to give that day, and sure enough, they had a verdict. So Masterson's family went into the courtroom knowing that there was a verdict on two of the counts. And given the statute of limitations on this, it actually doesn't apply to multiple counts of forcible rape. So prosecutors needed the multiple counts. They needed at least two convictions to send Masterson to prison. So there was a question on the charges, an aggravating factor of, do you find it true that he's committed multiple rapes? And they answered yes to that on the first one. So it was obvious that it was going to be two convictions. And that was a huge shock to Danny and his family. I mean, it's always hard to describe the reaction because Danny did not stand up or have any kind of shouting reaction, but you could kind of see it sinking in. And his wife, Bijou, did get very upset. And the judge ask her if she could calm herself down, and just said, I know it's hard. She said it kindly, I know it's hard, but if not, you'll have to leave the courtroom. And Bijou did quiet. She was sitting with family members, including Billy Baldwin, who's one of the Baldwin celebrity brothers. He's actually married to her half sister, and he'd been there the last few days waiting for the verdict, and he had been comforting her in the hallway as we were all waiting to go into the courtroom, because it was just a really nervous moment. But there were a lot of other people in the courtroom who I think were relieved, or this was just a long time coming for people who have covered the Church of Scientology, because the Church of Scientology factored in so big to the trial here. Because Danny's a second generation member of the Church of Scientology. He's been a member his entire life. And the church is recognized by the IRS as a tax-exempt religious organization, but it's also been long dogged by allegations that it's a cult. And the three victims were all members of the Church of Scientology when this happened. They all testified that they'd been harassed by the church, and that they all felt afraid to report Danny because of the protections that happened. The church has denied this. They issued a statement last night saying that this was an unprecedented, unconstitutional attack against the organization, and then the use of Danny's religion against him in the trial, they said, was unprecedented. So it'll be interesting to see if there are any appeal factors there, or what exactly happens. But the Church of Scientology was mentioned quite heavily in the first trial, but the second trial, it was even more so, because the prosecutors actually brought in a expert witness on Scientology. It was a historic moment in a courtroom. It was the first time anyone had ever testified as an expert witness about the Church of Scientology. And they brought in Claire Headley. She was a former high-ranking member. She and her husband were, and they're now outspoken about their experiences in Scientology, and they're members of an organization that helps current Scientologists transfer out of it into mainstream life. So prosecutors brought her in to talk about the organization of Scientology and the internal justice system that she said that they have. And she didn't talk about the actual facts of anything related to Masterson's case. She was just there to talk about what she experienced as a Scientologist, what she knows about the structure, and their focus on their internal justice system. And really the importance of her testimony was it corroborated what the victims had testified about, what they experienced from Scientology, kind of the bizarre backlash that they had when they tried to report Danny, and kind of the victim blaming that goes on in Scientology that they described. And one of the victims who he was convicted of raping, Jennifer B., this was back in 2003 when the crime happened, and she had actually gone to police. She had eventually gone to police in 2004, and there was a police report about it, and she testified about the experiences and the backlash she faced from people within Scientology after she did that. She said when somebody found out in Scientology, Julian Schwartz found out that she'd gone to police, he told her, you're going to be in so much trouble. So there was a lot of focus on the Church of Scientology's role, and why 20 years had passed between the crimes and when Masterson was going on trial. So I think the presence of Claire Headley as a expert witness added some clarification to the case that prosecutors presented that they didn't have in the first trial. And Claire Headley's testimony also reminds me of another big change in this trial, and that's some restrictions on the jurors that were put in place in the middle of trial. It actually happened after a former Church of Scientology member had a hallway confrontation with one of Masterson's supporters. And I wasn't there for the confrontation, but I was in the courtroom when the judge talked about it afterward and talked about some of the restrictions that were in place on the jury. They were no longer being allowed out during the lunch recess. They were being sequestered in the jury room, and then they were also being provided an alternative exit. So they were never walking out in the hallway, because some of the jurors actually saw this confrontation between the Church of Scientology member and one of Masterson's supporters. It was Aaron Smith Levin. He used to be in the Sea Org membership of Scientology, which is really elite. They consider themselves non-civilians, members of Scientology. But he is no longer a Scientologist, and he runs the YouTube channel Growing Up in Scientology. And he had been going to Masterson's trial with media credentials, and apparently he heard this, one of Masterson's supporters say that he wasn't affiliated with the Church of Scientology, and he has information to the contrary, and he had confronted him in the hallway. But it was a loud confrontation that was witnessed by jurors, and some people were concerned about it. The Masterson's lawyers, the prosecutors, were concerned, and I actually got the transcript for it and went over everything in this story here. You can see, but it was part of some really weird moments in the trial, which included the lawyer for the Church of Scientology was actually sitting in the gallery when Jen B was testifying, and Jen B had complained that she thought the lawyer was trying to intimidate her, making eye contact, and at one point it flipped her hair and kind of rolled her eyes, and it was at a opportune moment in the testimony. So the prosecutor, Reinhold Mueller, the judge actually allowed him to question Jen B about this. I thought it was really unusual as somebody watches a lot of trials, but Mueller actually said to her, was there somebody here in court that you recognized during your testimony that made you uncomfortable? This was the next trial day after her uncomfortableness had happened, and she answered, but Jen B answered that there was, and she went on to identify the Church of Scientology lawyer and said that she represents the church, David Miscavige, and then every witness that needed to come to court to testify. And Mueller asked, at some point during your testimony, did you happen to observe whether Miss Podberski had made any kind of gesture or any kind of facial gesture to you that made you uncomfortable? She said she did, and then testified that the lawyer had put her head down and stared at me with something, a really dead glare. So, I mean, just the fact that the gallery was becoming such a part of the trial, and the questions about members of the gallery, I just thought was really unusual. And I don't think we saw that in the first trial. It was just an example of some of the changes that we've had here. And then also just in terms of presentation and how prosecutors did just questioning witnesses, presenting their case. And the retrial always favors the prosecutors, and this seemed to be just completely exemplify that. And this time they also had a different prior bad acts witness. The California law allows for prosecutors to bring in a witness who testifies about a sex crime happening that's not charged in the case, but is used to support the idea that the defendant committed the sex crimes that he's charged with. And that's what they did last trial with Trisha Vesey. She was an actress who testified about Masterson raping her in 1998. But she didn't testify in this trial. Instead, they had Kathleen J. She went by Kathleen J. in the trial. She was from Toronto, Canada, and she said that Masterson raped her in 2001 during a party while he was up in Toronto filming the movie Dracula 2000. And she was actually interviewed by Tony Ortega of the Underground Bunker website, he's been covering Scientology since 1995, and he covered this entire trial, the first trial too, and has done a lot of really great, interesting reporting that's informed my own reporting on this. But the prosecutors actually got in touch with Kathleen J. After Tony's interview with her, and Tony actually came up a bit in trial. The Masterson's attorneys were talking about subpoenaing him because they're saying that what Kathleen J. said in her testimony doesn't match what was in Tony's story. So, of course, Tony didn't have to testify. There's a reporter shield law against that, but he had a lawyer there to argue against it. But there ended up being a stipulation to just submit his story to the jury as evidence of possible conflicting testimony from Kathleen J. But I'm not sure how much they're called 1108 witnesses sometimes, because that's the California Code of Evidence number that allows these prior bad acts witnesses to testify. It's kind of impossible to say without talking to the jury how her testimony factored into this, but just the fact that they deliberated for 8 days and remained split at the end of the deliberations on the third victim, who would be Chrissy Carnell Bixler. This is Masterson's ex-girlfriend. They were together for 6 years. I think just the fact that they deliberated so long and then still couldn't decide just shows that they really put a lot of time and effort into looking at the facts, looking at the charges and the instructions and where they fit in. So I mean, I think the actual circumstances surrounding the rapes that were charged were probably the biggest thing here. But the prior bad acts witnesses, they can always have an influence on it. So the prior bad acts witnesses was a big change. And then also the presence of Claire Headley, the expert witness on Scientology, but then also the ordering of the witnesses, which I thought was interesting, because in the first trial, Masterson's ex-girlfriend, Chrissy Carnell Bixler, was actually the one who garnered the most favorable deadlocked jury vote. Jurors were voted 7-5 in favor of acquittal for Masterson on her charge. So the other ones were 8-4 and 10-2. So Chrissy was actually didn't testify first in the first trial, but she did in this second trial. And to me, it was kind of obvious that, the prosecutors were saying if the jury in the first trial thought that she was the strongest victim, although 7-5 is not a winning vote for prosecutors, they would put her in front of the jury first. But then the second jury ends up still not convicting on her. They had a much more favorable vote for guilt than the first jury did. But I mean, it's just interesting to see the changes that prosecutors make in their case and to try to consider, whether it actually mattered or not. Because I'm not sure if the ordering of the witnesses mattered so much as just the change in presentation. They had Ariel Anson, who's a younger prosecutor than Reinhold Mueller, but she did the closing argument. And the consensus was that everyone thought she did great. I mean, she really did shine just in how she talked in front of a jury, because that is an absolute skill to get up there and just kind of wing it like that. I mean, she's obviously going places. So she did much better than Reinhold Mueller, personally. I mean, everybody thought that. So just in terms of presentation, things were better. It was just kind of a stronger case. And I didn't think Masterson's lawyers were very good. I didn't think Phil Cohen, his opening statement, I mean, I found it kind of stunning when he did this, but he put up quotes from the victims in the first trial, testimony quotes. It was hearsay. It was hearsay. He got shot down immediately because he was putting up excerpts saying, "Oh, here's what the victim said in the last trial," and just legally he wasn't doing it right to set it up right. So he got dressed down by the judge pretty hard. I wrote about it in this article, and she actually interrupted his opening statement and sent the jury out of the courtroom so she could yell at him for doing this. So things did not start very well for Masterson, and those kind of problems with your attorney not really understanding those legal issues, it's pretty alarming. So the idea that he was ever going to get acquitted, I think, was just out of left field. His best hope was always a hung jury, but the retrial always favors the prosecutors, and the victims all were brave and testified again and went through it again, and a couple of them released statements through their attorney, Allison Anderson. She's with Boyce Schiller. There's actually a pretty interesting civil lawsuit that Boyce Schiller is representing the victims in against Masterson and then the Church of Scientology and David Miscavige, that is going to now proceed after this. But they released statements just talking about how relieved they are, but then of course Chrissy also has to point out that she's devastated that the jury didn't convict on her charge. But But overall, I think there's a lot of relief on their part. Obviously that they got the 2 convictions, but for a lot of trial watchers, and especially, it was just pretty stunning, especially after the first jury really not seeming to like the case very much. To see a conviction like that and see him handcuffed after, just seeing him in the hallway for 6 or 7 months, over the 2 trials, and kind of chatting with his family sometimes. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to downplay what the victims went through or just the seriousness of the crime, but I'm just talking about, just optics. It was just like, wow, there he goes to jail, and he's not going to get out anytime soon. I think his lawyers could possibly make a appellate bail argument, but it's just they're kind of losing arguments after you get convicted like that. And the Judge Olmedo has seen it all. She's been around for a long time, and she knows all about this case. So it'll be a really interesting hearing next week, though, because somebody within the Church of Scientology obtained discovery in the case, discovery that prosecutors had released to the defense. This is like potential evidence, investigative documents, that kind of thing. And it was apparently supposed to be restricted to the defense attorneys and not released publicly, although they've pointed out that there wasn't a protective order on it. It somehow ended up in the hands of the Church of Scientology, and the judge is upset about it. And she's holding an evidentiary hearing next week, June 7th, to try to get to the bottom of it. There's going to be Phil Cohen and Sean Hawley, who were Masterson's attorneys in the last trial, and then Phil also represented him in the first trial. They're both going to be there. And then Tom Mesereau, who was, he's a celebrity attorney, represented Michael Jackson in his child molestation case, but he represented Danny originally in this, in the case early on. So he's expected to be there too, and possibly going to testify. He was actually in court at the courthouse yesterday, because the hearing had originally been scheduled for yesterday, because there was kind of some thought that the jury would have been done by then, but because the jury was still deliberating, it got delayed a week. So Mesereau is a pretty big name in LA celebrity law, and just the whole idea that there's going to be an evidentiary hearing into discovery leaking to the Church of Scientology, I think is quite interesting. And there's just questions about, what his attorneys are doing and how focused they are on publicity. I mean, there's a public relations person who sits in the courtroom. I mean, as somebody who covers a lot of trials and sees a lot of lawyers, I frankly always think it's kind of a red flag when a lawyer has a public relations person like that. But it's just, focus on the courtroom, guys. Like, let's do some better work for your client, because he just got convicted and he's facing 30 years. But as I said, this is a long time coming for the Church of Scientology, and I've learned so much through Tony Ortega's reporting, but then also just sitting in the courtroom listening to all this stuff and listening to Claire Headley's testimony about the alternative justice system and, kind of the protections in place for people who are seen to be doing well. Said a complaint would be filed with a yawn. So like someone like Danny Masterson, if he's doing well, he's on TV, he's being successful, if somebody complains about him, it's not going to be taken seriously. So just the pathway to getting to the charges and then getting to conviction, I think there's just so much more to be said there. So I'm definitely going to keep covering everything. I definitely plan to be at the hearing next week, and his sentencing, which has not yet been scheduled. There's going to be post-trial motions on August 4th, which would be like a motion for new trial or things like that. That's going to be something to watch for sure. I'm going to be covering all that. So I encourage everyone to keep tuning in and check out my written work. I'm creating a page for the Danny Masterson trial that'll have everything right there. But legalaffairsandtrials.com. Thank you so much.